So the confession reads, the Old Testament Hebrew, the New Testament Greek, being immediately inspired by God and by his singular care and providence, kept pure in all ages, are therefore, that is, the Greek and Hebrew, they're authentic. So as in all controversies of religion, the church is finally to appeal to them. All right, let me make some observations about this, and this is really important to get. First of all, the confession here assumes a distinction between the original writings of the Old and New Testaments and the copies of those writings. The technical terms for this distinction are the Autographa. How many of you heard of that term? Autographa, that refers to the originals. The actual parchment that Paul wrote on, the letter to the Galatians, or the vellum that Moses used to write Deuteronomy. So you have the Autographa, the writings, then you have the Apographa, those are the copies. When the authors of the confession are speaking of the preservation of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, they're not claiming that God actually preserved the Decalogue, okay, the actual stones on which the Ten Commandments were written, or the actual parchment of Paul's epistle to the Galatians. That's not their claim. What God preserved was not the original writings, but the copies of those writings, the Apographa. And it is the Apographa that the confession has primarily in view when it speaks of the preserved writings of the Hebrew and Greek Testament. So that's the first point, by way of clarification. Secondly, the confession asserts, okay, here I am, got the slides up here. It assumes or asserts a continuity between the originals and the copies. In other words, they don't make the distinction into a dichotomy. They don't say, well, the original writings are inspired by God, whereas the copies that were made of those writings are not inspired by God. What they actually say is that God has providentially preserved the inspired writings of Moses, Isaiah, and Paul through history. And the texts that they describe as authentic in the confession are actually the Apographa, the copies. Okay? So when they say the authentic text, they're not just talking about the actual parchment that Paul wrote on, they're talking about the copies of Paul's writings. Now this raises a question. Is the confession teaching that the Apographa, the copies, are just as inspired as the Autographa, the originals? And actually, I don't think we can give a simple yes or no answer to that question. Okay? In a sense, the answer depends on whether our focus is on the process by which God brings writings into existence, or whether our focus is on the product or quality of the writings themselves. Let me explain. First of all, God only inspired the original writings. Okay, and now I'm focusing on the process. I'm focusing on what God did for the prophets and apostles as opposed to what God did for the scribes who copied the writings of the prophets and the apostles. And I think that's the distinction that the Puritans would have made. They would have described God's superintendence of Moses, Isaiah, and Paul as divine inspiration. But God's superintendence of the scribes who copied the scripture writers, that's divine preservation. And yet, and see, here's the important point to get. The copies possess the quality of inspiration. And here we're focusing upon the writings themselves, the product, so to speak. And here the Puritans are stressing continuity. They're applying the quality of inspiration of the copies of the originals because, as they put it, God has kept pure the original writings by his singular care and providence. And if the very words of the inspired originals have been preserved in the copies, so has the quality of inspiration. Thus, when the confession describes the Hebrew and Greek scriptures as the only inspired, authoritative, infallible rule for faith and life, it does not reserve those qualities for the originals, which we don't have, but it applies those qualities to the copies which we do have. Okay? And that leads to a third observation, which I think is the main point. The confession affirms that God has taken special care to preserve the integrity of the Autographa, that is the originals, in the Apographa, that is the copies.